The first morning in a new home should have been peaceful. The soft hum of sprinklers, the faint chatter of birds along the fences, and the smell of dew resting on manicured lawns all suggested that serenity was finally within reach. For James Holloway, however, the tranquility felt deceptive. He stood on the porch of his newly purchased house, surveying the quiet cul-de-sac that was supposed to be his family's safe haven. The house had cost him every bit of savings, every late night at work, and every ounce of patience with a life lived in cramped apartments. Yet beneath the fresh paint and polished welcome, there was an unease that tugged at him. His wife, Lena, was inside unpacking boxes with their 2 children, laughing as they argued over who would get the room with the larger window. For them, the move was a promise of fresh beginnings. For James, it was a test. A test of whether he could finally give them stability without chaos, without the turbulence of landlords and rising rents. But as his eyes drifted to the opposite side of the street, he caught sight of her. A woman, late 50s, stood on her own porch like a sentinel. Dressed in a crisp blouse and pressed slacks, she held a clipboard that seemed almost fused to her hand. Even from a distance, James could feel the sharpness of her stare. Neighbors passed by her with polite nods, some with forced smiles, others avoiding her gaze altogether. She acknowledged none of them. Instead, her attention was fixed on James's house, as though cataloguing flaws invisible to everyone else. Lena joined him on the porch, sliding an arm around his waist. "She's been staring since we got here yesterday," Lena whispered. James forced a smile. "Maybe she's just curious about the new neighbors." "Or maybe," Lena countered, "she's already planning her first complaint." The thought was dismissed with a laugh, but the truth of it lingered. By the time dusk arrived, James discovered just how right Lena might be. As he carried the final box from the truck, a folded paper was waiting on the front steps. No envelope, no signature, just a sternly typed notice. To the new occupants of 17 Willow Court. All outdoor alterations, including flags, garden fixtures, and external furniture, require pre-approval by the Homeowners Association. Compliance is not optional. Failure to adhere will result in fines. James frowned, reading it twice. They hadn't even unpacked the silverware, and already there were rules being shoved through their door. He looked across the street. The woman was still there, arms folded, as though she had been waiting for his reaction. That night, while Lena tucked the kids into bed, James sat at the kitchen table, with the notice spread out before him. It wasn't just the words, it was the arrogance. No introduction, no welcome, just a command. He traced the edges of the page with his finger, the way he used to trace military orders years ago. But this wasn't a battlefield. Or so he thought. The following morning, his first true introduction to the neighborhood came in the form of whispers. As James trimmed the stray hedge, a couple walking their dog paused on the sidewalk. They nodded politely, but their voices dropped low as soon as they passed, drifting back toward him like smoke. He caught fragments. HOA president doesn't let anything slide. Poor guy has no idea. By midday, another paper arrived. This one taped firmly to the door. Harder to ignore. It cited the same clauses, adding bold words about consequences as though daring him to rebel. Lena found him reading it again, jaw tight. "She's testing you," she said quietly. Then she picked the wrong person. The resolve in his voice was new to her. She had seen James endure plenty. Deployments overseas, layoffs back home, countless disappointments that would have crushed lesser men. But now, standing in the foyer, with a simple notice in hand, she saw the same fire that once carried him through darker places. That evening, neighbors gathered in small clusters along the sidewalks, as though the summer air demanded company. James decided it was time to meet them. He crossed the street, introduced himself, shook hands, and forced casual conversation. Most were kind, welcoming even, but cautious. Their smiles flickered when the subject of the HOA arose. No one spoke the woman's name aloud, though her presence was unmissable. She lingered at the edge of every conversation, pretending not to listen, while her clipboard scribbled notes only she could understand. It was during one of these brief exchanges that James learned her name, Meredith Kane, president of the Willow Court Homeowners Association for over 15 years. A woman who, according to the whispers, had fined families for things as trivial as lawn decorations, for parking slightly off-center, even for leaving a garden hose unrolled overnight. She thinks this street is her kingdom, one neighbor muttered when Meredith turned her back. Best advice? Keep your head down. James nodded, but said nothing. He had never been the type to keep his head down. By the third day, the tension broke into open confrontation. Meredith marched across the street as James was setting up a modest flagpole near the corner of his yard. She didn't greet him. She didn't even breathe before snapping. That cannot be installed without approval. James rested the pole upright, meeting her glare with steady calm. It's not decoration, it's respect. The rules don't distinguish, Meredith shot back. It comes down or you'll regret it. Lena, watching from the porch, felt her stomach tighten. Neighbors began to glance over, some pulling out their phones discreetly. A silence spread across the street, like a curtain being drawn. James wiped his hands, stepped closer, and lowered his voice so only Meredith could hear. You've mistaken me for someone you can intimidate. Her jaw tightened. For the first time, there was hesitation in her eyes. Just a flicker, quickly buried beneath a scowl. She spun on her heel and stormed back across the street, muttering into her clipboard. That night, videos appeared in group chats. James hadn't posted them, but others had. Clips of Meredith shouting, of James standing his ground, of neighbors murmuring approval in the background. By dawn, whispers of change had already begun. The street was no longer united under Meredith's shadow. It was shifting. James didn't smile at the thought, nor did he celebrate. He simply sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the flag flutter gently in the morning air. He knew this wasn't victory. It was only the beginning of a war fought not with weapons, but with will. And Meredith Kane had no intention of surrendering. The air in Willow Court shifted after that first confrontation. Neighbors no longer looked at James with polite curiosity. They watched him with the kind of cautious hope reserved for someone willing to stand up to a bully. Children whispered to each other when he walked by, and even the elderly couple at the corner, usually hidden behind their hedges, offered him a timid wave. Yet, for every glance of quiet support, there was the looming presence of Meredith Kane, clipboard in hand, lips thin with disapproval. James didn't go looking for another clash, but Meredith seemed determined to force one. By the end of the week, he'd received 3 more notices, one about his recycling bins not being placed precisely against the curb, another about his children's bikes left on the lawn, and a third about the non-conforming height of his backyard fence. None of these complaints carried weight. They were petty, almost laughable. Yet, James knew the strategy. Wear him down. Drown him in paper until the fight drained out. At dinner, Lena spread the stack of notices across the table like evidence in a trial. Their two kids leaned in, giggling at how ridiculous some of them sounded. "She wrote you up for watering the grass at the wrong hour?" their son asked, incredulous. "Apparently, there's a schedule for that too," James replied dryly. Lena shook her head. "She's trying to provoke you. If you lose your temper, she wins." James nodded, but said little. He was never one to show his hand, not even to his own family. Inside, though, the old fire smoldered. He'd seen power plays like this before, in boardrooms, in chain-of-command disputes, in the quiet wars between men and women who clung to authority like oxygen. And he knew one truth. Bullies thrived only when others bowed. The opportunity to prove it came sooner than expected. The HOA scheduled its monthly meeting that Saturday evening at the community center. James hadn't planned to attend. He didn't relish the thought of sitting through hours of bureaucratic drivel. But Lena insisted. "If you want this to stop, you can't fight from the sidelines," she said firmly. So James went. Dressed simply in a collared shirt and jeans, no different from how he'd show up for a normal evening stroll. When he walked in, however, the room shifted. Conversations paused. Eyes followed him. Meredith was already at the front table, flanked by her loyal board members. Her pen tapped against her clipboard like a metronome, steady and sharp. "Mr. Holloway," she greeted, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How surprising to see you here." "I live here," James answered evenly. "That makes me a member, doesn't it?" She didn't reply, but her glare was enough. The meeting began with the usual monotony: budget allocations, landscaping contracts, holiday event planning. James stayed quiet, watching, listening, mapping the room. But when Meredith shifted the agenda to community standards enforcement, his patience ended. "As you all know," Meredith announced, voice rising, "we've had several violations recently. It's important to maintain our neighborhood's image. New residents must learn that the rules apply equally to everyone." Her eyes locked on James as she spoke. Murmurs filled the room, neighbors exchanging glances. Some avoided his gaze. Others seemed silently urging him to stay calm. James raised his hand. Meredith frowned, reluctant, but nodded. "With respect," James began, his tone calm but firm. "There's a difference between maintaining standards and harassing families. Notices about trash bins or watering schedules. That's not protecting the neighborhood. That's intimidation." Gasps rippled across the room. Meredith's jaw tightened. "The rules are clear, Mr. Holloway. If you choose to ignore them—" "I haven't ignored anything," James cut in. "I followed every reasonable expectation. But what you're doing isn't about rules. It's about control." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the board members shifted uncomfortably. Meredith's face flushed, but she forced a smile. "Perhaps you're unfamiliar with how associations work. They require discipline." "Discipline doesn't mean dictatorship," James said flatly. The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Meredith's grip on the room seemed to falter. A few neighbors even nodded subtly, emboldened by his stance. After the meeting, as people trickled out, Several stopped James in the parking lot. They spoke in hushed tones, thanking him, sharing their own frustrations with Meredith's endless rules. One elderly man admitted he'd been fined for having his grandson's basketball hoop in the driveway. Another confessed she'd been cited for leaving wind chimes on her porch. She's been running this place like her personal fiefdom for years, one neighbor said bitterly. No one's dared to challenge her. James listened, nodding. The stories weren't surprising. They confirmed what he already suspected. But hearing them aloud cemented his resolve. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was the neighborhood's. When he returned home, Lena was waiting. So? She asked, hope flickering in her eyes. James exhaled slowly, a rare smile tugging at his lips. We're not alone. That night, lying awake in bed, he thought back to the faces in the parking lot. Tired, frustrated, but hungry for change. He'd seen that look before. Soldiers beaten down by endless orders, until someone finally reminded them they had power too. Meredith had ruled through fear, but fear was fragile. All it took was one person refusing to bend, and the whole illusion could crumble. Across the street, Meredith sat in her home office, furiously typing. Her mind replayed James's words, each one like a thorn. For years, she had bent this neighborhood to her will. People obeyed because they believed disobedience carried unbearable cost. But this man, this newcomer, had turned defiance into a spectacle. Worse, others had noticed. She wouldn't allow it. As the clock struck midnight, Meredith drafted a new agenda. Stricter penalties, more oversight, public shaming of repeat offenders. If James wanted war, she would deliver one. Back in his bedroom, James finally drifted to sleep, unaware of the storm about to break. The battle lines were drawn. Willow Court was no longer just a quiet cul-de-sac. It was a battleground, and the opening shots had already been fired. The weekend after the meeting, Willow Court looked the same on the surface. Perfect lawns, trimmed hedges, the faint smell of barbecue drifting from a backyard. But beneath that glossy exterior, tension crackled like static. Every glance between neighbors seemed loaded with unspoken words, and every passing car slowed a little longer in front of James's house. James noticed the shift immediately. He'd lived through too many environments where silence meant danger. Outward calm was often the disguise before chaos. Saturday morning, while trimming his hedges, he caught sight of a folded paper tucked into his mailbox. No postage, no official letterhead, just a sheet of HOA stationery slid in under the radar. He unfolded it and read the words in Meredith's tidy, pointed handwriting. Your continued defiance undermines the harmony of Willow Court. Consider this your final warning. Next steps will not be so cordial. James stared at the note for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, he tore it clean in half and dropped it into the trash can. By midday, word of the secret note had already spread. A neighbor across the street approached while James was cleaning tools. She sent you one too? The man whispered, glancing around nervously. James frowned. One too? The man nodded. I found a paper stuck in my door yesterday. Said my dog's barking was a disturbance. My dog's 12 years old, half deaf. He barely makes a sound anymore. Soon, others began to murmur the same story. Quiet notes, slipped under doors or taped to mailboxes. They weren't official HOA violations, They were warnings, threats really, meant to intimidate. Meredith had shifted from petty citations to psychological warfare. That evening, James gathered his family around the dinner table again. "It's not just us anymore," he said, laying out what he'd learned. "She's doing this to everyone." But she made one mistake. Lena tilted her head. "Which mistake?" James held up his phone, where a neighbor had texted him a photo of their own warning note. "She left a trail, and trails can be followed." The following Monday, James left work early and headed to the county office. He spent hours sifting through public records, pulling HOA bylaws, and requesting documents most residents never bothered to read. When he returned home, a thick folder sat in the passenger seat beside him, like a loaded weapon. That night, long after the kids went to bed, James and Lena spread the papers across their dining table. Pages rustled under their fingers. Financial statements, meeting minutes, amendment filings. And soon, patterns began to emerge. Fines collected without proper documentation. Budgets padded with vague administrative costs. Expenditures for community events that no one could remember attending. "This isn't just abuse of authority," Lena whispered, pointing to a figure circled in red ink. "This is theft." James leaned back, rubbing his jaw. He'd suspected Meredith was power-hungry. But this was greed dressed as governance. And if there was one thing James despised more than a bully, it was a thief cloaked in righteousness. The next HOA meeting loomed, and James knew it would be war. When the evening arrived, the community hall buzzed with energy. More residents showed up than usual, filling every chair and lining the walls. Meredith looked flustered, but tried to mask it with her trademark smile. She opened the meeting with rehearsed poise, diving into announcements about landscaping improvements. James waited, his folder resting on his lap like a coiled spring. He could feel eyes on him, neighbors waiting, wondering. He didn't have to make them wait long. When Meredith transitioned to new business, James stood. His voice carried steady across the room. "I have documents to share." A hush fell instantly. Meredith blinked rapidly, her pen freezing mid-tap. "This isn't on the agenda," she snapped. "It doesn't have to be," James said. He laid the folder on the table at the front, pulling out copies he'd made. "These are public records, our HOA's financial filings, and they show funds that don't match what we've been told." The room stirred. People craned their necks, murmuring as James handed pages to the nearest neighbors. "Thousands of dollars," he continued, "marked as event costs with no receipts. Fines collected without board approval. Payments authorized by one person, not the group." His eyes met Meredith's. "That person is you." Gasps rippled. Someone near the back muttered, "I knew it." Meredith's mask cracked. Her voice sharpened like glass. "This is slander. You're twisting numbers you don't understand." James didn't flinch. "Then explain it. Show us receipts. Show us where the money went." Her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, Meredith Kane, the iron ruler of Willow Court, looked cornered. One by one, neighbors began to speak. A mother described the fines she'd paid for her daughter's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. A retired couple recounted fees charged for a shed that had stood since before the HOA existed. Each story piled on like stones, building a wall around Meredith. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Voices rising. Demands shouted. Meredith banged her gavel until her hand shook. But the sound was drowned out by the surge of residents, who had finally found their courage. Through it all, James remained calm, steady. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He simply stood as proof that one person's refusal to bend could ripple outward until silence broke. By the end of the night, no decisions were made. The meeting adjourned in confusion, neighbors leaving in heated clusters, their anger no longer aimed at each other, but at the woman who had ruled them. Outside, under the dim parking lot lights, James felt a hand clap his shoulder. It was the elderly man from before, his eyes bright with something that looked like hope. "We've been waiting for this," he said softly. James only nodded. He didn't need to say more. The battle wasn't over. It had only shifted. Meredith would not go down quietly. But for the first time, the balance had tilted. Across the street, Meredith sat in her car long after the lot emptied, her clipboard clutched tightly. Her empire was cracking, but she wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The fallout from that chaotic meeting didn't take long to show itself. By the next morning, the once quiet sidewalks of Willow Court buzzed with hushed conversations. Neighbors who had previously kept their heads down now lingered outside, comparing stories, swapping copies of the documents James had passed out. For years, Meredith had built her reign on silence. Now, silence was broken, and what spilled out was fury. James watched from his porch as two couples stopped at the end of his driveway, arguing in low but urgent tones. Their voices carried just enough for him to catch fragments. "She fined us for, never saw the event, can't believe all this time." When they noticed him, they didn't scatter like before. Instead, they waved. One of them, a woman with streaks of silver in her hair, stepped forward. "We're with you," she said simply. James nodded, not with pride, but with understanding. He'd seen this before, in very different contexts. Men and women who discovered they weren't alone anymore. Unity had a way of changing everything. Inside her home, Meredith felt the shift too. She stood at her living room window, blinds drawn just enough to peek through. The same neighbors who once smiled nervously in her presence now crossed the street rather than wave. A cold pit grew in her stomach, though she told herself it was only temporary. People were fickle. They'd come back once she re-established control. But as she sat at her desk and flipped through her binder of notes, her hands trembled ever so slightly. The numbers James had uncovered weren't lies, at least not entirely. She had moved money around, padded fees, justified it to herself as administrative necessity. It was all for the community, she told herself. Without her strict hand, Willow Court would fall into ruin. But even she knew that excuse wouldn't hold under scrutiny. Still, Meredith Kane had not built her reputation by admitting defeat. She adjusted her blazer, steadied her breath, and began to draft letters. Official ones this time. If intimidation had failed, she would weaponize procedure. 2 days later, envelopes appeared in multiple mailboxes. Official HOA warnings, typed neatly, citing breaches of decorum at the last meeting. Some residents were fined for disruptive conduct. Others were threatened with suspension of community privileges if they continued to spread misinformation. The strategy backfired instantly. Instead of fear, the letters sparked outrage. One by one, neighbors came knocking on James's door, envelopes in hand, voices raised with anger. "She's punishing us for speaking out. She can't do this." James ushered them inside, his living room soon packed with residents clutching papers. The air buzzed with indignation. but also something new, determination. "We don't have to take this anymore," one man declared. "We can call a vote." Heads turned. The idea lingered like an electric charge. James leaned forward, his tone measured. "Yes, you can. The bylaws give you that power. But it won't be easy. She'll fight it every step." Lena chimed in, flipping through the stack of documents. "It starts with signatures. A petition. If enough of you sign, the board is required to hold a special election." The room erupted with agreement. Pens scratched paper as neighbors began drafting right then and there. For the first time, the community wasn't just complaining. They were acting. Meanwhile, Meredith received the news within hours. A neighbor she trusted had slipped her a message. People were gathering at James's house, plotting against her. Her jaw clenched, and the pen in her hand snapped clean in two. That night, she sat alone in her kitchen, the house eerily quiet. The shadows seemed heavier, pressing against her. She replayed the last meeting in her mind, the gasps, the accusations, the way her authority had slipped like water through her fingers. Rage bubbled, but beneath it was something more dangerous, fear. By the end of the week, the petition had nearly every signature required. James didn't even have to knock on doors. Neighbors sought him out, eager to be part of something that finally felt like justice. Children whispered about it as they rode bikes. Adults smiled in passing, their faces lighter, as though a storm cloud had finally cracked. The tension reached a boiling point at the next scheduled HOA meeting. The community hall was overflowing, residents spilling into the hallway. The air hummed with anticipation. Meredith sat at the head table, clipboard clutched like a shield, her smile brittle and strained. When the floor opened for discussion, James stood, petition in hand. His voice carried clear and steady. "We, the residents of Willow Court, call for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership." The room exploded in applause, cheers shaking the walls. Meredith slammed her gavel so hard the handle cracked, her voice shrieking over the crowd. "This is out of order! This is not sanctioned! You will not undermine me!" But her protests were drowned out by the sheer roar of her neighbors. Voices united, no longer cowed by the threat of fines or letters. People chanted, "Vote! Vote! Vote!" Meredith's face drained of color. She could see it now, the empire she had built crumbling before her eyes. She had always believed fear would hold them together. But fear had given way to anger, and anger had turned to resolve. James remained calm in the storm, his petition raised like a banner. He wasn't smiling, but inside he felt something shift, something powerful. The community wasn't just following him, they were finding themselves again. As the chants grew louder, Meredith realized she had lost control. No gavel, no clipboard, no carefully crafted letter could silence what had been unleashed. The vote wasn't official that night, but everyone in the room knew it was coming. The tide had turned, and no amount of intimidation could reverse it. When the meeting adjourned in chaos, Meredith fled through the back door, her heels clicking frantically against the pavement. In the parking lot, she clutched her clipboard to her chest, whispering under her breath, "They'll regret this." They don't know what they started. James, watching from a distance, understood perfectly. Meredith wouldn't vanish quietly. People like her never did. The fight was far from finished. But for the first time, Willow Court was no longer hers to control. The days that followed the explosive meeting carried an energy Willow Court had never felt before. For years, People had lived under Meredith's shadow, obeying her notices, biting their tongues to avoid her wrath. Now, the air felt lighter, though laced with tension. Conversations happened openly on sidewalks. Neighbors who barely nodded at one another before were suddenly allies, bound together by a common purpose. James noticed it most in the small things. Children waved when he walked by. Couples invited him in for coffee, eager to talk strategy. Even those who had remained silent for so long now spoke with determination. "We'll see this through," one man promised as he signed the petition. "She can't scare us anymore." Meredith, however, was far from defeated. From her office window, she watched clusters of residents gather outside, whispering and laughing as though they'd already won. Rage boiled inside her. For years, she had poured her life into running this community, setting the rules, ensuring everything looked perfect, keeping outsiders from lowering their standards. And this was how they repaid her? With rebellion? She called an emergency board meeting at her home. Her loyalists, 2 longtime committee members she had carefully groomed, sat uneasily at her dining room table. Meredith's voice sliced through the room like a blade. "We are not letting this stand. Do you hear me? James thinks he can walk in here, stir up chaos, and tear down everything we've built. Not on my watch." One of them shifted nervously. "But Meredith, the numbers he showed, they don't look good if the county gets involved." Meredith's palm slammed the table, rattling the glasses. "Then we make sure the county doesn't get involved. Those numbers were taken out of context. And even if they weren't, do you think these people know how HOA finances really work? No. They'll believe what I tell them, the same way they always have." But she saw it in their eyes. Doubt. The loyalty she had relied on for so long was cracking. Across the street, James and Lena worked late into the night. Their dining room table was buried in papers, bylaws, financial statements, signatures. Lena highlighted passages while James typed up summaries. They weren't just organizing resistance. They were building a case. "You realize what this means, right?" Lena said, eyes flicking to him. "If we push this through, she's finished." James nodded slowly. "It's not about finishing her. It's about freeing them. People deserve better than fear." The night before the official petition submission, tension rippled through the neighborhood. Lights flicked on in every house as residents prepared themselves. Meredith paced her living room, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. She was losing her grip, and she knew it, but she wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, a caravan of residents marched to the HOA office, James at the front with the petition in hand. There were more signatures than required. Dozens more. People followed silently but proudly, their unity loud enough to echo across the street. Inside, the HOA secretary froze as James laid the papers on the desk. "By the bylaws, we call for a special election," he said calmly. News spread like wildfire. Within hours, phones buzzed with messages. Doorbells rang as neighbors shared the news. The election would happen in less than 2 weeks. Willow Court was officially on the edge of transformation. Meredith responded swiftly, blanketing the community with letters printed in bold ink. She warned of anarchy, of outsiders taking control, of the destruction of property values. But instead of fear, her letters sparked laughter. One teenager posted a picture of the letter online with the caption, "Guess we're all living in the apocalypse now." It spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Still, Meredith wasn't done. She hired a lawyer, a sharp-tongued man in a pinstriped suit, to intimidate the opposition. He sent notices claiming James had no right to call a vote, that the petition was invalid, that anyone who signed it could face legal action. James received his notice late one evening, tucked neatly into his mailbox. He unfolded it slowly, scanning the words. His jaw tightened, but instead of fear, he felt resolve harden within him. He showed Lena, who shook her head with disgust. She thinks this will scare you off. James folded the letter carefully and slid it into the growing stack of documents. Then she doesn't know me. When word of the lawyer's letters spread, the neighborhood didn't panic. Instead, more people stepped forward. If she's this desperate, one woman said, it means she's losing. The day of the election drew closer, and with it, the community transformed. Lawns were freshly trimmed, flags hung proudly, and porches were decorated as though people wanted to show they still cared. About the neighborhood, about each other. For the first time in years, Willow Court felt alive. Meredith, though, grew more isolated. Her once loyal allies began to avoid her calls. Even the board members who had sat at her table started to distance themselves, whispering about their own futures. She doubled down, appearing at doorsteps uninvited, lecturing residents, trying to sway them with polished speeches, but doors closed faster than they opened. One evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows across the street, James walked his usual route. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, calling out greetings, clapping him on the back. It wasn't hero worship. He had never wanted that, but solidarity. They weren't following him. They were walking with him. Meredith watched from behind her blinds, her fists clenched tight. For the first time in her reign, she felt something she couldn't control. The neighborhood she had ruled for so long was slipping from her hands, not with a bang, but with unity. The night before the election, tension hung like thick fog. James couldn't sleep. He paced the floor, memories of his past life as a soldier mixing with the present battle. The faces of his neighbors flashed in his mind. The fear they once carried, the hope they carried now. Tomorrow wasn't about him or Meredith. It was about them. Meredith stayed up too, seated at her kitchen table with papers scattered everywhere. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them, but she couldn't stop. Somewhere in her mind, she still believed she could win. Still believed fear could bring them back. But outside, the street was already different. Neighbors whispered, laughed, planned. The future was theirs to claim. And by sunrise, Willow Court would never be the same. The morning of the election dawned heavy with anticipation. The sun rose over Willow Court with a strange stillness. Lawns were mowed, flags fluttered, and porch lights glowed faintly as residents stirred earlier than usual. It wasn't just another HOA meeting. This was the day everything changed. James woke before dawn, unable to rest. He stood by the window, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, as he watched the quiet street come alive. One by one, cars pulled out of driveways. Neighbors dressed in their best casual clothes, as though attending church, made their way toward the clubhouse at the end of the cul-de-sac. Lena placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've done everything you can," she said softly. "Now we see if it was enough," James replied, his voice low but steady. The clubhouse, usually half empty during HOA meetings, was packed before the meeting even began. Folding chairs scraped across the tile floor. Children sat cross-legged against the wall, and whispers filled the air like electricity. The petition, the financial records, the lawyer's threats. Everyone had lived through weeks of chaos. And now, the climax had arrived. Meredith arrived last, dressed sharply in a navy suit, clipboard tucked under her arm. She swept into the room with the air of someone still convinced of her power. A hush fell as she strode to the front, chin lifted high. For years, she had commanded respect simply by being in the room. But today, eyes narrowed instead of admiring, and arms crossed instead of applauding. The board, seated stiffly behind the long table, avoided her gaze. They had once been her shield, her enforcers. Now, they looked more like hostages to her collapsing reign. James sat among the residents, Lena at his side. He felt dozens of eyes glance at him, some with gratitude, some with nervous hope. He didn't move, didn't speak. He wasn't here to grandstand. The truth would do that for him. The meeting began. Meredith's voice rang out, steady but strained. "Neighbors," she said, her tone practiced. "We are here today to protect the integrity of Willow Court. Outside influences and false claims have threatened the harmony we've built. But I assure you, as your president, I have always acted in your best interest." Murmurs rippled across the crowd. A woman near the back whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Best interest? My dues went up 3 times in a year." Laughter followed, breaking the tension. Meredith's jaw tightened. She pressed on, her words sharp. "The so-called petition is invalid. It's based on misinterpreted data and emotional manipulation. I ask you all to consider what chaos will come if we abandon tradition." James rose slowly from his chair. The room grew quiet. He carried a simple folder, nothing more. His voice, calm and even, filled the silence. "These are not misinterpretations. These are county records. These are bank statements. And this petition was signed by more than half of you." He laid the papers on the table with deliberate care, sliding them toward the board. The board members shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. "We have reviewed the petition. By the bylaws, it is valid. An election must proceed." The words hit like a hammer. A cheer erupted from the back, small at first, then spreading like wildfire. Neighbors clapped, stomped, shouted their support. Meredith pounded her gavel, shouting for order, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of people no longer afraid. When quiet returned, the voting began. Slips of paper were handed out, pens passed from row to row. People bent over their ballots, some with trembling hands, others with bold strokes. Children whispered to each other, sensing the gravity of the moment. Meredith sat rigid, her knuckles white against the clipboard. James watched her, but not with gloating. Instead, he felt a strange sorrow. This was a woman who had built her life on control, and now she was watching it slip away one vote at a time. The ballots were collected in a clear plastic box. The board members counted them slowly, methodically, under the watchful eyes of the community. Each slip of paper felt like a weight dropped into history. Finally, the head of the board stood, holding the tally. His voice shook, not from fear, but from the enormity of the moment. "By majority vote," he announced, "Meredith Rowe is removed as president of the Willow Court Homeowners Association, effective immediately. The room exploded. Cheers, claps, tears of relief. People hugged, high-fived, even cried openly. Some banged fists on tables, chanting James's name. Meredith's face crumpled, but she forced it back into a mask of dignity. She stood, her voice breaking. "You will regret this. Without me, this place will fall apart." "No," someone shouted from the back. "Without you, this place can finally breathe." Meredith's eyes scanned the room, desperate for allies. But even her closest supporters looked away. One by one, people turned their backs as she stormed out of the clubhouse, heels clicking like gunshots against the tile. Silence followed her exit. Then the crowd erupted again. Children ran laughing through the aisles. Adults gathered around James, clapping him on the shoulder, thanking him. But James raised his hands, quieting them. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "This is about us. About taking back what was always ours. Our voices, our choices, our community. We don't replace one tyrant with another. We build something better together." The applause this time was softer, more genuine. People nodded, eyes shining with hope. It wasn't just victory. It was the start of something new. That night, the clubhouse lights glowed long after sunset. Neighbors stayed to talk, to plan, to dream. Ideas flowed. Community gardens, neighborhood watch groups, holiday events. Things that had been forbidden under Meredith's rule now seemed possible. James and Lena slipped away quietly. Walking home under the golden streetlights, he carried no clipboard, no documents, just Lena's hand in his. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," he corrected gently. Behind them, laughter and conversation echoed into the night. Willow Court, once bound by fear, was free at last. Yet in the shadows, Meredith's car idled at the edge of the street. Her eyes burned as she watched them. Though stripped of the title, her bitterness lingered. In her heart, the battle wasn't over, not yet. The days after the election felt almost surreal. For years, Willow Court had existed in a strange state of quiet tension. Every neighbor wary of Meredith's rules, her clipboard inspections, her unexpected fines. Now, the air seemed lighter. Conversations lasted longer, and people actually lingered outside without fear of being reprimanded for lawn decorations or trash can placement. James noticed it during his morning jog. Families were walking their dogs together, children laughing loudly as they raced bikes down the street, a man strumming his guitar on a porch. It was as though the neighborhood itself had taken a deep breath. Yet beneath the laughter, James sensed unease. Change was never simple, and not everyone was ready to embrace it. He caught sight of a few neighbors avoiding his gaze, others whispering near mailboxes. Some who had once supported Meredith now seemed lost, unsure of where they fit in this new reality. Lena, ever the voice of balance, reminded him of something crucial. Don't mistake silence for peace. Not everyone is happy about what happened. And Meredith, she's not the type to fade quietly. James nodded. He knew his wife was right. Even without the title of HOA president, Meredith still had influence. She knew people's secrets, their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses. She had built her power on fear, and fear didn't disappear overnight. That evening, a group of neighbors gathered in James's living room. Folding chairs borrowed from the clubhouse lined the walls, and the smell of coffee and fresh cookies filled the air. People wanted to talk about what came next, about the board's direction, about how to keep the neighborhood united. Pamela, a retired schoolteacher with silver hair, spoke first. "We've been given a second chance. But we can't waste it. If we don't organize, if we don't put real systems in place, someone like Meredith could take advantage again." Heads nodded in agreement. James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Pamela's right. This isn't just about replacing one leader with another. It's about building a community that runs on trust, not fear. That means more voices at the table, more transparency, and more fairness. A younger neighbor, Malik, raised his hand. "But what about Meredith? You know she won't let this go. She's been quiet these past few days, but that's what scares me. She's planning something." The room fell silent. Everyone knew Malik was right. Later that night, as the last guests trickled out, James stood at his window again, just as he had the morning of the vote. He saw a familiar car parked under a streetlight at the edge of the cul-de-sac. Meredith's sedan. She sat in the driver's seat, unmoving, watching. His chest tightened. She wasn't gone. She was waiting. The following morning, evidence of her presence began to show. A rumor spread that James planned to double HOA dues. A flyer appeared in mailboxes, accusing him of falsifying records. It claimed the petition was manipulated, that signatures were forged. The paper wasn't signed, but everyone knew who was behind it. At the grocery store, Lena overheard two women whispering, their tones sharp. He's no better than she was, just wants control for himself. James knew he couldn't ignore it. He called another meeting, this time in the open air of the clubhouse lawn so everyone could attend. Dozens gathered under the setting sun, folding chairs arranged in rows, voices buzzing with questions. James stood before them, holding the flyer in his hand. "You've all seen this," he began, his voice steady. "And you deserve the truth. These are lies. Every signature on that petition was real. Every record was verified by the county. And anyone who doubts it can look at the documents themselves." He held up the folder, thick with proof. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded, reassured. Others looked skeptical. James knew words alone wouldn't be enough. Trust had to be rebuilt brick by brick. Pamela stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. "I was one of the first to sign that petition. I watched James work tirelessly, not for himself, but for all of us. If you believe these lies, then you haven't been paying attention." Her defense drew applause, but James noticed a few crossed arms, furrowed brows. Meredith's poison still lingered. That night, Lena urged him not to lose hope. "She's trying to divide us because divided people are easier to control. Don't play her game. Keep showing them who you really are." But Meredith escalated. The next day, someone spray-painted "traitor" across James's garage door. Children gasped as they walked past. Neighbors rushed to help scrub the words away. But the message was clear. This was no longer just whispers and flyers. This was intimidation. James filed a report with the local police, but they could do little without proof. Meredith was too clever to leave evidence tying her to the act. That evening, as he stood scrubbing the last traces of paint, Malik joined him. "She's desperate," Malik said quietly. "That's why she's lashing out. People like her, They don't know how to live without control. But you've already won more than she can take away. Don't forget that. James felt the weight of Malik's words. This wasn't just about an HOA anymore. It was about something larger. The fight between fear and freedom, between control and community. As the week drew to a close, Meredith made her boldest move yet. She called a gathering of her supporters at her house. Neighbors who still feared her, or who had benefited from her rule, attended. From across the street, James saw them huddled in her living room, lights blazing late into the night. Whispers of her plan reached him the next day. She wanted to sue, to take the neighborhood to court, claiming her removal was illegal. It was an outrageous move, but one that could drag everyone into another storm of conflict. James met with Pamela, Malik, and a few others that evening. They sat around his dining table, exhaustion etched on their faces. If she takes this to court, Pamela said, we'll spend months fighting her. It'll drain us financially and emotionally. That's what she wants, to scare us back into submission. Lena spoke firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. Then we don't let her. We stay united, no matter what. If she wants a war, she'll find out we're stronger together. James looked around the table, at the weary but determined faces of his neighbors. They weren't just fighting for lower dues or better rules anymore. They were fighting for the soul of their community. He knew the battle wasn't over. Meredith wasn't finished, but neither were they. And deep down, James felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope that, no matter how dark the road ahead, light still waited at the end. The days grew heavier as Meredith's threat of legal action spread across Willow Court like a storm cloud. Some neighbors grew nervous, whispering about lawyer fees and depositions. Others clenched their jaws, furious that one person could still hold so much sway after everything they had endured. James knew the uncertainty was the weapon Meredith wielded best. She didn't need to win in court. She only needed to make people fear what losing might cost them. On a Saturday morning, James organized a neighborhood forum. Not a formal meeting with Robert's rules and motions, but a casual gathering in the cul-de-sac where people could speak freely. Folding chairs formed a loose circle. Children chased each other in the grass, their laughter colliding with the tension that hung in the air. Pamela spoke first, her voice steady. Meredith thinks she can intimidate us with the threat of a lawsuit. But remember, truth is on our side. Every document, every signature, every vote was legal. A few neighbors nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. An older man named Harold cleared his throat. I don't doubt the vote was fair. But if she drags us into court, the lawyers will bleed us dry. What then? We can't risk losing our homes over pride. The circle grew restless. James rose, holding the folder of evidence he kept close at hand. I hear your fears. I share them. But this isn't about pride. It's about principle. If we give in, we teach her and anyone like her that intimidation works. We don't build communities by surrendering to fear. From the back, Malik called out, so what do we do? How do we fight back? James took a breath. We prepare. We gather every piece of proof. We build a legal defense together. And we show Meredith that if she wants a war, she won't be fighting one man. She'll be fighting all of us. For the first time, a ripple of determination passed through the group. The forum didn't end with solutions, but it ended with resolve. People lingered, talking to each other about pooling resources, about volunteering time, about hiring a lawyer, not for James, but for the community itself. That night, Lena sat with James at the kitchen table, the yellow glow of the lamp casting shadows across stacks of papers. "You're carrying so much on your shoulders," she whispered. James rubbed his temples. "If I don't, Meredith wins. And if she wins, it tells everyone that fear is stronger than unity." Lena placed her hand over his. "You don't have to fight alone. Let them carry some of it too. That's the whole point of community." The next week brought signs of change. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now knocked on James's door offering help. Pamela brought baked bread, insisting they take breaks. Malik offered to call in a lawyer friend for advice. Even Harold, the cautious skeptic, arrived one evening with a stack of financial ledgers. "If we're going to defend ourselves," he said gruffly, "we'll need to be ready to show every penny has been spent properly." But Meredith was not idle. Flyers returned, this time slicker, more polished, claiming James had plans to demolish community amenities, raise fees, and even restrict who could buy homes in the neighborhood. The lies spread fast, faster than the truth. One afternoon, while walking Max along the sidewalk, James overheard two teenagers whispering as they rode past on scooters. "He's the guy trying to kick people out," one said. His chest tightened. Meredith's smear campaign was seeping even into the minds of children. That evening, he called an emergency gathering. The clubhouse filled, tension buzzing like static. Jane stood at the front with the folder of proof. "These lies have to stop. I can't control what Meredith says, but I can show you the truth." He laid out documents, the petition, the signatures, the county verification. He explained, line by line, the community's finances, where every dollar of dues had gone, how every project had been accounted for. Some faces softened, others hardened, unwilling to be convinced. But James didn't stop. He spoke from the heart, his voice breaking at times. "I didn't fight to remove Meredith for power. I fought because fear was tearing us apart. If you think I'm here to control you, then you don't know me. I want us to live in a neighborhood where kids can laugh, where neighbors share coffee, where we trust each other." That's all. Silence filled the room. Then, slowly, Pamela began to clap. Malik followed. One by one, neighbors joined until the sound echoed off the walls. Not everyone applauded, but enough did to shift the air. Meredith's allies sat stiff, eyes cold. One of them, a man named Clyde, muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." They filed out quickly, their loyalty to Meredith unshaken. The following morning, Meredith made her boldest move yet. A thick envelope arrived at James's door. An official notice of intent to sue, filed in the county court. The paper trembled in his hands as he read it. She wasn't bluffing anymore. Lena read over his shoulder, her face pale. "What does this mean?" "It means," James said quietly, "the fight just became real." That evening, word spread like wildfire. Some neighbors panicked, fearing the cost of legal fees. Others grew angry, vowing to fight alongside James. The cul-de-sac buzzed with debates late into the night. For the first time, the community stood on the edge of a true divide. Not just between Meredith and James, but between fear and courage. James gathered his closest allies in his living room. Lena, Pamela, Malik, Harold, and a handful of others. They sat around the table, the lawsuit papers spread before them like a battle map. Pamela's eyes blazed. We can't let her scare us into retreat. If we back down now, she'll haunt us forever. Harold sighed, but there was steel in his voice. Then we prepare. We raise funds, we hire counsel, and we fight her in court. If she wants a war, she'll get one. James looked around the room, at the tired but determined faces of his neighbors. He thought of the laughter he'd heard on his morning jog, of the children's carefree games, of the simple joys that Meredith had tried to crush. He realized then that this wasn't just about an HOA. It was about protecting a way of life worth fighting for. He closed the folder and set it aside. Then it's settled. We won't let her win. We'll stand together. And no matter what happens, we won't go back to living in fear. The group nodded in solemn agreement. Outside, the street was quiet. But James knew somewhere in the shadows, Meredith was already plotting her next move. The battle had only just begun. The lawsuit set the tone for everything that followed. What had once been a tense standoff between neighbors now turned into a community on trial, at least in spirit, if not yet inside a courtroom. Fear spread fast, but so did determination. Every mailbox seemed to carry whispers. Every doorstep became a place of debate. James spent hours on the phone with lawyers. Most offered cautious advice. Settle if possible. Avoid escalation. Protect yourself. But to him, settling meant surrendering. Meredith had ruled through intimidation for too long. If they folded now, she would tighten her grip again the moment the dust settled. One evening, after a draining call with a lawyer who quoted fees high enough to bankrupt an average family, James stepped outside. The night air was cool, the street lamps casting faint pools of light across the pavement. He found Pamela waiting on the curb, her arms crossed. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said softly. "I've seen the price of justice," James muttered, "and it's more than most of us can pay." Pamela handed him an envelope. "Neighbors have been donating. A little here, a little there. It's not much, but it's a start. People want to help. Let them." Inside the envelope was nearly $500. Small bills collected from doorsteps and kitchens. James felt his chest tighten. "Pamela, they shouldn't have to." "They want to," she interrupted firmly. "You gave us courage. Let us give you strength." Word of the donations spread. Within days, jars marked "For Our Defense" sat on counters in kitchens, on folding tables at bake sales, even at the corner store. Kids dropped in quarters. Retirees slipped in tens. Slowly, the fund grew. But Meredith was relentless. Her allies doubled down, cornering neighbors with sharp words and warnings. Flyers painted James as reckless, dangerous, a man trying to dismantle the neighborhood's harmony. A few people withdrew support, scared by the looming legal storm. Yet others pushed back harder. One afternoon, Malik approached James with an idea. "We've been playing defense this whole time. It's time we go on offense." James frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Malik said, lowering his voice, "we gather everything Meredith has done. Every misused dollar, every threat, every rule she bent to serve herself. We don't just defend against her lawsuit. We build a case against her." It was bold, risky, but the more they discussed it, the more it made sense. Meredith's reign had left scars, and those scars could become evidence. Neighbors began sharing stories, quietly at first, then openly. Harold produced financial records showing inflated invoices signed off under Meredith's watch. Pamela revealed emails where Meredith had threatened fines over trivial issues. Even children recalled being told they couldn't play outside after certain hours because it ruined the neighborhood's image. James compiled everything, page by page, photo by photo. What began as a defense folder swelled into a thick binder, labeled simply The Truth. When Meredith caught wind of it, her fury was palpable. She stormed through the neighborhood, clipboard clutched like a weapon, barking accusations. One evening, she cornered James in his own driveway. "You think you can smear me with lies?" she hissed. "These aren't lies," James replied evenly, holding her gaze. "They're the words of the people you claimed to represent." For a moment, Meredith's mask slipped. Her eyes flashed with something between rage and fear. Then she spun on her heel and marched away, her voice sharp as glass. "You'll regret this." The following week, the community gathered again at the clubhouse. The air was electric, the tension thicker than ever. Meredith sat at one end of the room, flanked by her few loyal supporters. James stood at the other, binder in hand. "I didn't want this fight," he began, his voice steady. "But it came to us, and now we have to face it together." He opened the binder and began presenting. Receipts, letters, testimonies, each piece chipped away at Meredith's carefully built image. Murmurs rose and spread through the room. Some neighbors gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. Meredith interrupted, shouting over him, "This is slander! He's twisting everything!" But the binder spoke louder than her voice. The evidence was undeniable. Pamela stood and added, "We've all lived under this fear for too long. It's time we say enough." One by one, neighbors voiced support. Malik spoke of strength through unity. Harold, once cautious, admitted he had been blind to her tactics. Even quiet families, who had never spoken at meetings before, found their voices. By the end of the night, the room felt changed. Divided still, yes, but the tide was turning. Meredith had relied on silence and fear, but silence was breaking, and fear was giving way to courage. That night, James returned home exhausted but hopeful. As he sat with Lena on the porch, the flag he had once raised as a personal act of remembrance now fluttered as a symbol of the community's defiance. "They believe in you," Lena whispered. James shook his head. "They believe in themselves. I just reminded them how." But deep inside, he knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Meredith wouldn't back down easily. The lawsuit was still real, still looming. And desperation made people dangerous. The stars above seemed distant, cold, and silent. James closed his eyes, listening to the rustle of leaves, the quiet murmur of the street. He could almost feel the weight of the entire neighborhood pressing on his shoulders. Yet for the first time, he also felt their hands lifting it with him. The fight was far from over, but something had shifted. Meredith no longer stood as an untouchable force. She was cornered, her power cracking. And James, once just a homeowner seeking peace, was now the reluctant leader of a movement. The lawsuit hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning, but the tension in Brookside built long before the gavel struck. Cars lined the street outside the courthouse, neighbors arriving in clusters, whispering nervously. Reporters with cameras hovered near the entrance. Catching wind of the dispute, that had turned a quiet suburb into a battleground of principle. James adjusted his tie in the reflection of a car window. He wasn't used to suits, preferring jeans and work boots. But today was different. Today wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been silenced, intimidated, or bullied. Lena squeezed his hand as they walked up the courthouse steps together. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and paper. Meredith sat at the opposite table, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes blazing with determination. Her lawyer, sleek and sharp in a tailored suit, leaned close to whisper strategy. James's own attorney, a local volunteer who had stepped forward after hearing the community's plea, arranged the thick binder of evidence on the desk. When the judge entered, the room stilled. Papers rustled, throats cleared. The hearing began. Meredith's lawyer launched first, painting James as disruptive, a man unwilling to cooperate with community standards. He spoke of order, harmony, and tradition, his words slick but hollow. Meredith nodded along, her eyes darting toward the crowd as if daring them to disagree. Then it was James's turn. His lawyer rose, opening the truth binder. One by one, documents were presented. Receipts of misused funds, letters filled with threats, testimonies from neighbors, photos of community events where Meredith had bent rules for her allies, but punished others for the same. The evidence stacked higher and higher, a mountain against her flimsy denials. The judge listened intently, occasionally raising an eyebrow. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Each piece of proof was a reminder of what they had endured. At one point, Meredith stood abruptly, her voice trembling with fury. "This is all lies. These people are ungrateful. Without me, this neighborhood would fall apart." The judge silenced her with a stern look. "Sit down, Mrs. Rowland. You'll have your turn." James didn't gloat. He simply stood and addressed the court directly. "I'm not here to tear down this community. I moved here because I believed in it. But rules should not be weapons, and leaders should not rule through fear. What we're asking for is simple: fairness, respect, the chance to live without being harassed for hanging a flag, planting flowers, or letting children play outside. That's not chaos, that's freedom." For a long moment, the judge said nothing. Then she leaned forward. "I've reviewed this evidence carefully. It is clear this board has been mismanaged and power has been abused. The lawsuit against Mr. Daniels is dismissed. Furthermore, I recommend an independent review of the HOA's practices." The words landed like thunder. Meredith's face drained of color. Gasps filled the room, followed by a swell of applause before the judge called for order. Outside the courthouse, sunlight broke through the clouds. Neighbors surrounded James, clapping his back, thanking him. Pamela hugged him tightly. Malik raised his fist in triumph. Children darted between adults, laughing, their joy contagious. Meredith exited with her lawyer, shoulders hunched, avoiding the cameras. The once untouchable queen of Brookside Lane now looked small, diminished, her power crumbling with every step. That evening, the neighborhood held an impromptu gathering. Folding chairs filled front lawns. Tables groaned under the weight of casseroles, pies, and lemonade pitchers. It wasn't a meeting, it was a celebration. People laughed freely, voices unburdened for the first time in years. James stood by the flagpole in his yard, watching the children play hopscotch on the pavement. Lena joined him, slipping her arm through his. "You did it," she whispered. He shook his head. We did it. Everyone who spoke up. Everyone who stood together. That's what made the difference. Pamela approached with a warm smile. You know, James, you've become the heart of this street. Don't deny it. Without your stand, we'd still be bowing to her. James chuckled softly. I never wanted to lead anything else. I just wanted peace. Sometimes peace is won by standing firm, Pamela said gently. As dusk fell, someone lit string lights across fences. Music played from a speaker. The neighborhood, once divided by fear, now pulsed with unity. For the first time, Brookside Lane felt alive, not because of order imposed from above, but because of the voices that rose together. James looked at the flag above his garden, fluttering in the evening breeze. No longer a solitary act of remembrance, it had become a beacon for everyone who believed they deserved better. And though Meredith's shadow might linger in rumors or bitterness, it no longer defined them. The neighborhood had chosen. They had chosen each other, and so Brookside Lane found its freedom. What began as one man's quiet defiance became an entire community's stand against fear and control. The lesson was clear. Real power doesn't come from rules or titles. It comes from unity, courage, and the refusal to stay silent. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more dramatic HOA tales and neighborhood battles. And tell us in the comments, would you have taken a stand like James or walked away?